I'm in Bucksport, Maine today, and it may be a little loud here because I'm right on the main road, but there's really nowhere else I can stand to do this. And behind me you see a grave marker for Colonel Jonathan Buck, whose name gave the name to this town, Bucksport. But it's the legend associated with him that is best known around these parts. And when I asked local people what sites I should visit of any significance, everybody mentioned the Witch's Foot. And that is the story behind the monument behind me. So what happened basically is this. Jonathan Buck is said to have overseen the trial of a local woman who was convicted of being a witch. She was burned as a witch, and as her body was burning, her leg detached and fell out of the fire. And supposedly her son or some relative put a curse on Colonel Buck. And that is the reason for the mark that you see on the granite marker behind me, which has the shape of a witch's foot. The idea was he was cursed, and after the monument was placed, that witch's foot appeared to indicate the curse that had been placed on Colonel Buck. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll talk about some of the problems with that story. So I'm going to try to get a little further from the road. Hopefully it'll help. Hopefully this isn't too loud. You can see the sign right here that indicates the monument. So let's talk about some of the issues with that story. Number one, Colonel Buck died in 1795. His lifetime was long after most of the witch trials that happened in the northeastern part of the United States. Now, Maine was part of Massachusetts during his lifetime. And of course, Massachusetts is known for the most famous of witch trials, the Salem witch trials. But if you know anything about the Salem witch trials or about any of the witch trials that existed, that occurred here in New England, you'll know that none of those people were ever burned for witchcraft. They were hanged for the most part. There were other ways of torture and things like that, but the executions took place by hanging here in the United States. There's no record of any person ever being burned as a witch here in America. Second, there's no record of anybody in Maine, in what became Maine, ever being convicted and executed for being a witch. Third, Colonel Buck's not buried right there. That marker was actually placed about 60 years after his death by some of his descendants. And he's actually buried in another part of the cemetery. And it was only in those many decades after he died and after that monument had been placed that that mark appeared on the granite. Now, people who work with granite will tell you that defects like that are very common, and they only usually show up after the granite has been polished and placed and it begins to oxidize. And so that is the reason for the mark. It has nothing to do with the witch's curse, and there was no story that was ever out there about anyone putting a curse on Colonel Buck until that foot appeared, and then somebody invented the story. So it's a cool piece of Americana, it's a cool roadside history story, it's a neat place to stop. But there's no truth whatsoever to any of the story behind the witch's curse and Jonathan Buck.